Okay, it is recording now.
Well, it is 7 o'clock, and so I'm going to begin the June the 7th webinar. And I want to thank everyone for being on, both our panelists and for those who are listening this evening. So I want to thank you all for joining us in the first San Mateo County Juneteenth 2022 webinar, featuring local perspectives about the history, meaning, and significance of honoring the official end of slavery in the United States in 1865. We hope that the events that the county has put on to commemorate the Juneteenth holiday increase awareness and provide education about a part of American history that hasn't received proper recognition. Supervisor Groom and I hosted a flag raising at the county center last week. We're so honored to have one of our former colleagues, Supervisor Rose Jacob Gibson, and the Reverend Lori Owen speak. We, of course, also had the Speaker Pro Tem from the California Legislature, Kevin Mullen, as well as others. In any case, we had the pleasure of hearing Ms. Marie Davis and her son Garrett saying the Black National Anthem, "Lift Every Voice and Sing," for all of us. The next three webinars were focused on housing, education, and the resiliency and creativity of Black Americans as we move forward. And tonight, our focus will be on the impact of Juneteenth on Black Americans, and specifically what three community leaders see as the future of racial justice for Black people and other people of color in San Mateo County. And with that in mind, I'll turn it over to our excellent moderator, Cletra Newton, to provide some housekeeping about the Zoom webinar and outline some history and context and begin this evening's discussion.
Thank you, Supervisor Horsley. Welcome, everyone. We begin this evening with a few housekeeping notes. This webinar will be recorded. Recording will be available on the County Juneteenth webpage. Webinar attendees will be able to ask questions throughout the Q&A feature and can interact with staff running the webinar through the chat function for technical questions. Attendees will not be able to chat with other attendees. A live transcript is available through Zoom, and I believe that everyone can see the live transcription button at the top of your screen. A survey will be sent at the end of this webinar series to all registered participants to gather feedback and idea for next year's celebration. With that, we move forward into beginning this webinar. As Supervisor Horsley so graciously introduced, I am Cletra Newton, your moderator. Tonight, we have an esteemed panel of thought leaders within San Mateo County. To begin, I'd like to introduce Ms. Henrietta Burrows. I would like to introduce Dr. Omowale Satterwhite, and I would like to introduce Chief Ray Iverson. Thank you all for being here. A bit of context about tonight's discussion and why it's so important to continue the conversation. In 1863, we know that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Abraham Lincoln. And we know that in 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified to further enforce the law that slavery, in fact, had ended. But we didn't stop there. In addition to the 13th Amendment ratification, it went on to read that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Scholars, activists, prisoners have linked that exception clause to the rise of the prison system that incarcerates Black people at a more than 5 times the rate of white people and profits off their unpaid and underpaid labor. This suggests that the 13th Amendment still allows for involuntary servitude or debt slavery where convicted of a crime. Juneteenth, short for June 19th, commemorates the official end of slavery in the United States, but Black Americans continue to face discrimination. And with that, I would like to pose an opening question to Supervisor Horsley. As a result of raising the Juneteenth flag at County Center on June 3rd, and certainly hosting and agreeing to structure this webinar series for additional education. And begin by asking, why was it important to continue the conversation around a topic that only last year was signed into federal law?
Well, thanks, Cletra. Well, in recent years, the county has issued many proclamations, resolutions, and ordinances dedicated to furthering equity, justice, diversity, and inclusion within San Mateo County departments, as well as within the general population. The acknowledgement of Juneteenth as a county holiday, raising the Juneteenth flag, and conducting these webinars are important steps towards increasing awareness about our marginalized community. We can all do to create a world where everyone succeeds and thrives, not just a select few. It's also important to acknowledge why the county hasn't taken these steps previously, which requires many of us who work in the public sector to reflect honestly on what held us back before 2022. Bias and systemic racism are deeply ingrained in ourselves and our institutions. And it can be difficult to open our eyes and acknowledge our failings. But until we do that, we can't take the step forward to repair the damage caused by centuries of oppression. This webinar series is intended to provide a space for all of us to sit and consider the impacts of historical oppression and how it continues to show up today. It's also intended to encourage us to reflect on how our personal and professional lives can be used to honor the principles of the Declaration of Independence and work towards true liberty and justice for all. And one of the things I said when we spoke at the flag raising is that I always remember that I used to go to one of these Democratic clubs. There was a guy who's now passed on. And at the end of the Pledge of Allegiance, when it said liberty and justice for all, he would loudly say, someday. And I guess that brings us to, that's what we're hoping for, that someday to be in the near future.
Thank you for the response to that question, Supervisor Horsley. It's so true. Liberty and justice for all someday. And we are definitely still in the hope that that someday will arrive in our lifetimes to create a better world for not only ourselves, but also future generations. So that leads me to another question. And Dr. Satterwhite, I'd like to ask this question of you. What is the significance of Juneteenth for Black people in the United States?
Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, I was having audio problems and I apologize. But let me just say that I was born and raised in the Midwest in Akron, Ohio. And I first heard about Juneteenth as an undergraduate student at Howard University. I first celebrated Juneteenth in the late 1960s in East Palo Alto. After I came to this area to attend Stanford, and I'm a 50-year resident of East Palo Alto, and so I've been celebrating Juneteenth for more than 5 decades. And I always put the disclaimer, I can't speak for Black people, but I certainly will share my own thinking of what this means to our people from the perspective that I share. When I reflect on the Black experience in America, I often use the 7 principles of Kwanzaa as a basic framework to shape and share my ideas. And as most of you know, Kwanzaa is a year-end celebration, a holiday celebrated by Black people that was created by Dr. Maulana Kiringa, who chairs the African American Studies Department at Cal State University, Long Beach. And those 7 principles in both Kiswahili and English are Umoja, unity, Kujitagalia, self-determination, Ujima, collective work and responsibility, Ujamaa, cooperative economics, Nia, purpose, Kuumba, creativity, and Imani, faith. So when I reflect on Juneteenth and its meaning for Black people, I think about the Black experience in the USA in terms of these guiding principles. First, Umoja, or unity, which calls on Black people to strive for and maintain unity in the family, the community, the nation, and the race. So Juneteenth is one of the few national commemorative events that ties Black people together all over the country and unifies us around the common cause. It reminds us that, as nobly stated by the Honorable Marcus Garvey, we are one people with one aim and one destiny. Kujichagulia, or self-determination, calls on Black people to define ourselves, name ourselves, create for ourselves instead of being defined, named, created for, and spoken for by others. And so each year, Juneteenth is celebrated in communities across the country and reminds us that Black lives matter and that Black people must have the leading voice in defining both our legacy and our destiny as a people. Ujima, or collective work and responsibility, calls on Black people to build and maintain our community together and make our brothers and sisters problems our problems and to solve them together. And each year, Juneteenth reminds us that we are a communal people and that it is the responsibility of the village to raise the child. Cooperative economics calls on Black people to build and maintain our own businesses and to profit from them together. Juneteenth reminds us that Black people are ultimately responsible for our own economic welfare and that we must work together to build a brighter economic future for ourselves. Nia, or purpose, calls on Black people to make our collective vocation the building and developing of our community and to restore our people to their traditional greatness. And Juneteenth reminds us that we have therefore a common purpose and a historic duty to build or rebuild our communities into the Wakandas of tomorrow. And Kuumba, creativity, calls on Black people to always do as much as we can in any way that we can in order to leave our community more beautiful and beneficial than when we inherited it. And Juneteenth reminds us that we have Black genius and that through our own creativity, we will not only change our own communities, but can change the world. And finally, Imani, or faith, calls on Black people to believe with all our hearts in our God, our people, our parents, our teachers, our leaders, and the righteousness and victory of our struggle. And finally, Juneteenth inspires us to stand proud, confident, devoted, and unyielding in our struggle for truth, and justice in the USA. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Satterwhite. That was fantastic. I appreciate the rich and very enthusiastic education, not just for the panelists, but also for all of the attendees. I think the more that we educate and communicate, the more that we in fact do begin to unify. And with reference to your comments, I want to ask this question of Henrietta regarding the Black experience in the USA. The Black experience is often a singular and siloed experience to Black people in particular, or an individual experience. And Juneteenth is in fact intended to unify. How can we create a more collaborative approach to that unification when oftentimes, again, the Black experience is so siloed and misunderstood?
Well, I think that's a fascinating question. And the first thing I think in terms of collaboration, if you're going to have collaboration, then it needs to start with education and awareness. And if you're going to have people collaborate with each other, then they need to see what's in it for them and why it is that they should be collaborating. And in this particular case, Juneteenth can be seen from different perspectives. One is through a negative light, that it was a time of deception, it was a time of exploitation, and it was a time for keeping people ignorant. I mean, that's just the fact that 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, people found out that they were free is a shame. It's a stain on our country. And it's a stain for all of us because it does not represent the ideals of this particular country. And first of all, I'd like to commend the county for its recognition of Juneteenth. It's a recognition that has been long delayed, and it's just like freedom for the Black community. complete freedom, complete access, complete opportunities, that too has been long delayed. And I think getting back to the idea of collaboration and the need for education, it's allowing people to see that the progress we're talking about, equality, the equity, the inclusion, isn't a zero-sum game where some people will have and other people will have not. That's where we are right now, where some people have and some people have not. So what we have to do is educate people to see that we all gain when it comes to equity, inclusion, when it comes to diversity, that we all are the healthier for it. We all are enhanced by it. And when you talk about collaboration, when you can allow people to see how their future and their health is tied with everybody else in this country, I think then that we've gone a needed step towards recognizing the importance of Juneteenth and recognizing what it means for all of us, not just the Black community. Yes, in some cases, it might have been siloed. It might have been siloed for even some Black people, just like Emancipation Proclamation. Not everybody knew about it. So that collaboration can start with education. It can start with inclusion. It can start with the recognition of the importance of diversity. It can start with the equity that was referred to by Supervisor Horsley. I hope that answers your question from my perspective.
It does indeed. Thank you for sharing your perspective. I appreciate that. Chief Iverson, I'm going to pivot to you to talk about diversity. First of all, we would like to acknowledge you and recognize not only your service as a leader amongst our first responders and protectors within the county, but also that of your servicemen and women who work alongside you to keep the county safe and cared for. So thank you so much for joining us. With regards to diversity that Henrietta just spoke about, I think that's critical in terms of where you have ascended to and the space in which you orbit within the county in a leadership capacity. What does racial justice look like for Black people, in your opinion, and other people of color in San Mateo County moving forward?
That's a great question, Cleature. I appreciate that question.
And it's hard act to follow for Dr. Molly and Ms. Henrietta Burrows, but I do my best. One of the things that I look at is the Juneteenth celebration does, though, is it acknowledges and celebrates the history of Black people, not only in the present, but in the past, and also gives opportunity to recognize Black people for the future. So as a Black person, as a Black man, speaking for myself, from my perspective, being on this earth for 50 years, being in this profession for 31 years, most of my adult life. As a leader in the fire service in San Mateo County, I think there is a lot that can be done to move our county forward as we looked at the topic of social justice and racial justice for Black people and people of color. I think there is a great opportunity for us, and I appreciate the recognition that the county has given the attention to this date, the Juneteenth holiday celebration, but really looking at the meaning behind that, the opportunity that we have to get commitments from everyone in our community, each community member, to make substantive change. And everyone who does their part can make that become a reality. From my perspective, and diversity, equity, inclusion is one of the main focal points of my career at this point in my career, is to help bring forward racial equity and justice to the community as far as public safety goes. Being the only African-American chief officer in the entire county, I think I have an opportunity to fill a leadership role. And what I want to do is help others to see and recognize the fact that diversity is our strength in this county and the state and this nation. This nation was built on the backs of immigrants and from different walks of life, different parts of the world. They all come together to build this great country that we all live in. So I think in this county, we can take that perspective that we don't
not measuring a person by the color of their skin, but measuring them by their skills, abilities, and their potential. I think that's something we can all take to heart and something that we can all embrace as a community. One of the things I reference to is a pack of Skittles. You know, there's multiple colors and varieties. Enjoy the rainbow. We can all make a difference in San Mateo County.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. That's absolutely right. You know, when we talk about the commemoration of Juneteenth and the education of Juneteenth and what San Mateo County is doing to reinforce its commitment within the community and create that common purpose around liberty and justice for all. It's interesting to me that the experiences of Black people and people of color often are misunderstood. And I think because of that, it creates somewhat of a disconnect for people to really lean into the understanding of something like a commemoration and the history of Juneteenth. Dr. Satterwhite, what can we do to remedy that misunderstanding within our community at large? So as we're all growing, educating, and becoming aware, we're also bridging the gap of disconnect around what Juneteenth means and how it's rooted in liberty and justice for all.
Thank you for that really, really important and challenging question. Let me just, again, begin with some context. When I came to the Bay Area in the late 60s, there were majority or near majority Black communities in Northern California, in Del Paso Heights, and Fillmore, Bayview, Hunters Point in San Francisco, in Oakland, and East San Mateo County, and San Mateo City here, and then in East Palo Alto and Bellhaven and Menlo Park. And in Southern California, Allenstown, Watts, Compton, and some neighborhoods, specifically in San Bernardino and San Diego. There are no majority Black communities in the state now. And as a result, there's been a loss of Black political power and cultural identity, compounded by high and significant and persistent inequalities in virtually all phases of family and community life. And so I think that the journey begins then with acknowledging the historical context and the reality in which we find ourselves. And for me, racial justice or racial equity, if you will, is a social condition where inside the Black community, we have the capacity to govern, provide for, educate, protect, and sustain ourselves. And then in terms of how we relate to other communities, we have the voice, the influence, and the agency in regional, state, and national affairs. So when I came to Stanford, Martin Luther King, that very first year, he got assassinated, and the Black Student Union at Stanford did an action. And that was, marvelously led by our two co-chairs. I was a member of the BSU and happened to wind up on the committee that wrote the demands and ultimately became the one in the convocation where the BSU took its public action to deliver the demands. And even as I reflect back then, that was a Black issue and an effort to create Black justice on the Stanford University campus. But when we wrote those demands, 3 of the 10 demands spoke to the need for the university to not only address the issues for Black people, but for people of color across the spectrum. And so even going back then and now, as Black people seek justice, we don't just seek it for ourselves. We seek to create the conditions where justice is available and accessible, and that all people of color and other people benefit from the journey that we take for making a more just society. And for me, the 2 main issues here, especially given the demographic context that I shared, I always think about preservation on the one hand and transformation on the other. So as it relates to the Black community and now other, especially low-income communities of color, on the preservation side, there are 2 key issues. We got to keep the people here. And that's about affordable housing and jobs and education and healthcare and a bunch of other stuff that allow people to have quality, healthy, secure, safe lives. And the other part of that preservation kind of issue, the second factor or variable there is one, keeping the people here, but also creating the stories, sharing the stories, documenting and preserving the stories. So in East Palo Alto on July 1 and 2, we are launching a community archive. And so we spent the last couple of years beginning the process of documenting the story of the people of color in East Palo Alto that we'll share with the world. On the transformation side, of course, it means then economic development in East Palo Alto that's linked to the regional economy on the one hand, and then capacity building and infrastructure development so that we can realize the principles of Kwanzaa that I cited at the beginning of this dialogue. And so all that we do, while centered in our own self-interest, actually creates a context and an opportunity for us to partner with other people who have similar and common interests. And as I think Henrietta said so eloquently, so that we can learn together, so that we can communicate together, and that we can walk arm in arm.
Thank you, Dr. Satterwhite. You know, I really appreciate, again, your ability to lead us through the historical context of where we were and where we are now, and create a framework for possibly how we might move forward. And Henrietta, to Dr. Satterwhite's point, if we're looking at a journey toward liberty and justice, particularly in San Mateo County with Black people and people of color at large, does that journey involve the social construct that we've narrated up to this point? Or should the conversation be slightly altered so that people are able to really put down their guard and participate in the conversation without fear or discouragement?
Well, Keitra, before I answer that, I'd like some clarification. When you talk about the social construct, what are you talking about? Could you give me an example?
I think hosting the Juneteenth flag and starting this conversation, which San Mateo County has so bravely done, creates a social construct that allows people who were not necessarily engaged in the conversation around Juneteenth, its history, the how and the why, to start to participate and to form ideals and opinions that are vastly different from perhaps what they understood Juneteenth to be. So as we move forward with that as an anchor, do you think that there's a way to broaden and expand that conversation?
Well, just the fact that this social construct, as you just now defined it, has begun is a very important step, because it shows leadership, and it's leadership that sets the stage. If you have good leadership, if there are city policies, if there are county policies, if there are government policies that are in fact concrete policies, then people have something that they can follow. They know what the values are. They know what the goals are. They know what the ideals are. And so it's very, very important that what we have now is not just a flash in the pan. Supervisor Horsley talked about the goals of equity and inclusion and diversity. And where we have to go is make sure that those aren't just words, that we're not giving lip service to something that sounds good, that there are concrete policies put in place that will further those goals and further those ideals. So we have a long way to go, but at least we've taken some steps. And what I think is very, very important is the Committee on Reparations. Just the fact that that exists. And I think it's important that we see what comes out of it. And what comes out of it can be a standard for the county to follow, so that there isn't just lip service, that there's concrete action that's taken that will be a highlight, so to speak, a standard for everybody else to follow. So what's happened, Juneteenth has started at the grassroots. And I have to say, since Dr. Satterwhite and I were at Howard University together, he mentioned the fact that he became aware of Juneteenth. And as someone who came to California 10 years after him. It was when I started working in East Palo Alto that I became aware of Juneteenth. So if we can, starting with the grassroots and having this concept and the goals that have been enunciated in our webinar, if we could have those continue to be advocated by the leadership of this community, then I think we've made some very important steps towards educating the rest of the populace and putting a standard in place that people can follow with goals that can unify us, which is something that's so enormously important right now, considered how divided this nation is.
Thank you for that. I agree. And thank you for making sure that I clarified the question in a way that you can respond. I appreciate your response, and I appreciate the idea of a community standard on diversity and inclusion that's being certainly framed and reinforced by the county. I think that's so important because, as you just stated, it provides everyone with actionable goals around what this looks like for us to unify. And Chief Iverson, if I could ask you, regarding unification, what would unification look like to you in San Mateo County? It's very similar to the question that I asked you before, but racial justice and unity are goals, but unifying is vastly different, and it's more connectional, in my opinion, as we move forward, because if people feel aligned and connected to one another, then they think differently. Even if we think about our friends who are diverse in diverse communities and populations that we have. So again, my question to you is, what would unification look like in San Mateo County for you?
It's a great question, Collector. And one of the things I look back and we talked about how Juneteenth is something that we all used to talk about as kids. As my grandmother would tell me about Juneteenth and my great grandparents, and we talked about it amongst ourselves. But it wasn't until President Biden made this a national holiday to put this conversation on the national stage. And it wasn't until our Board of Supervisors put this platform out to have the flag raising and have this conversation to make this a local and a state, a national conversation. But I think one of the things we might want to take away or miss on this, not only talking about racial justice and social justice, but also freedom. Freedom has part of this, has to be part of the conversation. That's what Juneteenth's about. It's about freedom for Black people from enslavement, freedom from bondage, freedom from being restricted with movement. And freedom has been defined as the possession of the power and the resources to fulfill one's purpose. So I think today, in order for us to come together for unification, and we have to ensure that Black people are able to reach their full potential by leveling the playing field, providing equal opportunity, meeting people where they are and helping them succeed and be successful. The same rules should apply to everyone, no matter what the person looks like. In order for us to be unified, we have to move past color and race and look at the person, individual opportunities that we all should have equally the same opportunities. And as a county, taking advantage of opportunities that we can make that difference, make that substantive change, where we can look at people for their abilities versus their race or their color, to make some positive movement into increasing diversity and inclusion of all people of color and Black people as well.
I appreciate that, Chief Iverson. Thank you so much. As we begin to wind down just a bit in this conversation, would Henrietta or Dr. Satterwhite, would either of you like to expand upon Ray's comments in regards to freedom?
Well, Dr. Satterwhite, were you about to say something?
I yield to you. Absolutely.
Well, only briefly will you yield, but thank you. Freedom is absolutely essential. And I so appreciate the chief's recognition of that, because without freedom, there's not very much that you can do. And you have to be able to make choices. And freedom gives you the ability to make those choices. And we've seen a lot of choices made now by so many people that have been in their self-interest. And what we need to do is educate people to see the difference that their choices can make for the betterment of all of us. So I think Chief Iverson made an important point too, when he talked about us seeing each other as individuals. Because when you talk about the Black community, in so many people's minds, that concept in terms of Black community has been shrouded with all kinds of stereotypes. So there are those who look at the community as a whole within that framework of stereotypes and look at individuals within that framework of stereotypes. Because your skin is the color it is, therefore, and you can mention the stereotype, you do this, or you come from that, or you lack this, or you have these habits. And it's very, very important when we approach people, regardless of their race, their nationality, their sex, their sexual orientation, that we see them as individuals. And so we have to give ourselves that freedom, that ability, where we take off the shackles of our own minds and let go of all the stereotypes that we might have grown up with, to look at people as individuals, and that we see that we have the freedom of choice ourselves to make individual choices. Just because our parents believed one thing or acted one way or voted one way, or the people around us do certain things, that we are individuals who have certain freedoms. And if this society can encourage those freedoms, can enhance those freedoms, can respect our individual freedoms, then that gives us a framework in which we can act as free individuals. And of course, freedom entails responsibility, where we have to assume the responsibility for our actions and for our choices. So just in terms of following up on Chief Iverson's comments about freedom, I just think it's just so absolutely important that we recognize the importance of freedom. Especially, that's what Juneteenth is all about, recognizing freedom and having the freedom to be individuals, to be self-ruling, to be self-sustaining. So I'd like to thank the Chief for even mentioning that, and teacher, thank you for following through on it and allowing me to make my comments in terms of it. Freedom is absolutely essential for good health, for good relationships.
I think that's a great way to respond and close the response to my question. Thank you so much for leaning in. Supervisor Horsley, your hand is up, sir.
You said a couple of comments that, we did, we've heard people, I did get a couple of emails from people who said they couldn't understand why we would do Juneteenth. My response back is that Irish do St. Patrick's Day, Italians do Columbus Day. Why isn't there something that celebrates for Black Americans? And so that's, it's just kind of a simplistic view to them. But the other thing I was going to say is that I came to East Palo Alto about the same time that Dr. Satterwhite did in 1972. And I remember the devastation of the community caused by essentially that, redlining, and you couldn't, if you owned a home in East Palo Alto and you're paying on a mortgage, you couldn't sell it. And so people did walk away. And so there were vast tracts of land that, were abandoned. And so I did see the devastation in the community. And I guess I grew up in an all-white community. And I never, for me, it was like, it's coming to a realization. I had no idea about the effects of bad public policy and how devastating, the devastating effect it has on a community. I also remember when Ravenswood High School was shut down. And so kids from East Palo Alto had to get in a bus early in the morning to go to some other school where they weren't really welcome. And, I just thought that when I was the sheriff, I guess, for any white public official like myself, we probably have not done enough. I did try to look at implicit bias for officers. We did these testings with Stanford University. And my argument always was, our officers come from the community. The community it's the broader community that has the implicit bias, and we all have to change, not just cops. And I also remember, I remember one time Jesse Jackson, when he was running for president, and seeing the pride in the community for a Black man running for president in the United States of America. And I always was, I thought I really could identify for that, because I'm not Irish, but I was Catholic. And when John F. Kennedy was running for president, he was the first Catholic president. And so I found myself identifying oftentimes with, basically the people of East Palo Alto. And the last thing I'd say about East Palo Alto is that, well, there was, my 1972 time, there was a lot of crime stuff, but what I always found that people were warm, inviting, and always knew how to have a great time. And so I spent a lot of time going to a lot of festivals in East Palo Alto over the years. And I wish I could have done more. And that's it.
Thank you so much for that, Supervisor Horsley. I really appreciate, as I'm sure does everyone else, your sharing some additional historical knowledge, some of your experiences, and having the courage to speak in a vulnerable manner to say, I'm sure that there's more that could have taken place. Oftentimes, bridging the gap and creating unity and a meaningful connection starts with an acknowledgement that perhaps this could have been approached in a more meaningful way. So I think that is just simply outstanding. I think what the County of San Mateo is doing to create this platform and raise awareness, as we've shared tonight, even more so in that it continues the conversation where it absolutely could have stopped with the raising of the Juneteenth flag. And with that, I think we are going to open up the comments to our attendees for questions if they have any. And the questions will be directed to our panelists.
While they're coming in, Keitra, Dr. Satterwhite might have wanted to say something in terms of freedom.
Oh, I apologize.
He gave me the floor. So.
Okay, absolutely. No, Dr. Satterwhite, please.
No, very quickly. It really is humbling to be able to be in this space with all of you and to learn and grow and share and connect, and then also being connected to a broader audience. For me, I think when there are a body of ideas, identity, freedom, democracy, justice, equity, all of which mean different things to different people. And so you've asked a couple questions about how do we make the connection, the collaboration, take the broader journey together. And the chief's comments caused me to think about this body of ideas, all of which have their own different meanings to different people, and to understand and to reinforce what Henrietta said, is that it probably, and as I process that, it begins with being proactive and making connections, creating a space for dialogue. And out of that dialogue comes discovery. Out of the discovery comes alignment. And out of the alignment, hopefully, joint and shared action over time. And so, the notion of these ideas and bringing people together to engage in meaningful discourse, leading to meaningful action, I think is the thing that is a calling for all of us. It's certainly a calling for the village who has the duty to raise the child.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, it doesn't appear that we have any additional questions. So with that in mind, are there any closing statements after Dr. Sadowitz from you, Henrietta, or you, Chief Iverson, that you'd like to share with the community? And also Supervisor Horsley.
Thanks.
I'd like to ask Supervisor Horsley, where does he think the county can go next year? How does he see the county progressing along the topic that we've been discussing tonight? What's the next step in terms of the recognition of Juneteenth?
It's a good question. I personally do believe in reparations in housing and education. And we have an affordable housing fund. And I would hope that what we do, especially with once the state, well, there's actually a group that's asking the state to, can't think of the name right now, but asking for some specific money for housing for Black Americans. So it seems to me that if we talk about reparations, where we really, I think we could make the most difference really is in housing and being able to, and providing really low interest loans or maybe even forgivable loans. So I think that's going to be part of something that we'll pursue in the future. Now, I'm only going to be here for 6 months and my successor, but I will certainly hopefully it's we'll see who it is, but I would certainly encourage them to look at that. And the other is that education, and Ravenswood has always struggled. Well, I'll give you pretty, you know about Tinsley kids, I think, East Palo Alto. And I challenged people in Los Lomitas. I said, you tell me, how are those Tinsley kids doing? How do they do compared to the other kids? And they said, well, their performance is not quite good. And that's because they don't have all the enrichments that other families have. And so I would challenge them, you got to do better. Don't tell me that those Tinsley kids, at the bottom of the class. I want them at the top of the class. So I think we need to really focus on figuring out, kids, for example, like in Los Lomitas, they get all kinds of after school activities and enrichment, and other kids don't have that. So we have to figure out a way of providing those kinds of after school and enrichment activities to make sure that those children do as well as their peers. And I think those are the two areas that the county really can make a significant difference.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
I just want to say, first of all, I'm privileged and honored to be amongst such great community leaders and being able to have this conversation with Juneteenth and Black people and people of color being top of mind. We all have a role to play in making a difference. And Supervisor Horsley mentioned some of the things the county may do, but each one of us as community leaders and community members can do things to make a difference. And I know for my part, my number one priority is to help progress and advance opportunities for people of color, minorities in the county, because it's something that I think has been long overdue and something we all can have an impact on, and everyone's position, everyone's role, whatever level of impact that can be. If everyone does just a little, that'll help bring forward a new area of opportunity in San Mateo County for all people.
Well, I think what we've heard and what we've discussed is commendable. However, whenever you set a goal, and especially in this country of equity and diversity and racial harmony, we've seen all too many times, especially in the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the Great Society legislation, and we see it now, the pushback, where those who are in power or those aligned with power are reluctant to share that power. And so as we talk about collaborating and as we talk about the goals, I'd like for us to keep in mind that what we've talked about is going to come up against pushback. For example, Supervisor Horsley talked about getting emails of why the county's celebrating Juneteenth. And I can imagine that there will be emails coming in like, why are low rate mortgages being given to people in the Black community? Why aren't those available for all of us? And so I think as we're currently working towards those ideals that we've been talking about, that we need to be aware of pushback that those ideas, ideals, and our efforts are going to cause, and begin to consider the strategies of how we're going to overcome that pushback as we design the programs and push forward the goals that we're talking about.
Dr. Satterwhite, any final comments from you?
No, as I reflect on what everyone has said, deep in my heart, I know I love East Palo Alto. And if it's in San Mateo County, I love San Mateo County too. And so my Libra tells me that, or Martin Luther King said, the arc of history trends toward justice. And so my Libra tells me that's the direction we're going.
Thank you, sir. I am vastly committed to advancing equity and inclusion in the business ecosystem. That is my lot, that's my work. And I so appreciate all of you participating tonight. I believe that communication serves as a bridge over troubled waters, but at the end of that bridge, action is required. And to Henrietta's point, without action and a strategy, this will then a year from now remain just a rich conversation that was had. So it's important, to Chief Iverson's point, that we all take up objectives, goals, actionable items to make sure that we are doing our part to move the needle forward, to create the spaces that we all hold and can share for one another, and work again in collaboration with San Mateo County, other counties, elected officials, people in leadership to create that understanding and help mold that strategy to those who are open and receptive to thoughts and ideals of progress. Because Juneteenth really is, in my opinion, about not just freedom, but progressive freedom. Thank you for creating mindset shifts for everyone who attended and listened. And next week, we will host another webinar that will be on June 14th at 6 p.m. I'm sorry, 7 p.m. It will be at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And the topic will be centered around housing. And the conversation continues for San Mateo County Juneteenth 2022. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Stay well.